Dawna, let's start, since we're at Colby-Sawyer College, let's start with your coming to Colby Junior College. I think you grew up in upstate New York. Is that right?
I did. I grew up between Utica and Syracuse, New York, in upstate New York.
Great. So how'd you land here? What brought you to Colby-Sawyer? Can you parse that out, or was it? It might be hard as a 17 or 18-year-old to sort of parse out what that decision-making process was like. But tell us a little bit about that.
No, I actually started looking at college catalogs when I was 14. I was ready to get out of the house. I wanted to go to a women's college. And I have to say, I didn't have the grades for Smith or Mount Holyoke at the time. I liked school, but I had many other interests. So school didn't always come first. I was accepted to Hood College in Maryland.
Ah, what a great place.
Colby in New Hampshire. I can't remember where else, but I picked Colby because I wanted to be in New England, where I could ski and enjoy the outdoors.
Great.
That's how I ended up at Colby Junior, which then changed. It was during that time that Colby tried to be Colby College, New Hampshire, and then was sued by Colby College in Maine. And so it became. What year did it become Colby-Sawyer College?
Right as you were graduating, I think. So I think you actually, your class actually attended all three institutions. I think you were at Colby Junior, Colby College of New Hampshire, and Colby-Sawyer College all in one time. So you have that distinction to claim.
That's right.
Wait, did you actually take advantage of the outdoors and ski when you came? Did you keep that interest and pursue it?
I had a student's pass to King Ridge.
Great.
And was there a lot during my time at Colby.
That's great. And what other things are you involved in here on campus? What did you do in those 2 years here?
In my first year, I was elected as president of Burpee Dorm. In fact, I still have my journals from those days, and I went back and read a little bit before this call to see what I was talking about, and so that was a big event in my life. It was, as I said in my journal, it's the first time I've been president of anything. So that was one of the things I loved about Colby, was that women were in charge of everything. Women were the presidents, women were the head of organizations. I used my time at Colby to try things I had never done before, like dance. I took Joel Conrad's dance class, which I adored, and participated in a dance performance, something I'd never done in my life. So those were, I took photography. I loved photography. I learned to develop film. I spent hours. It was in the basement of the administrative, the big administrative building, which I'm on the name now.
Colgate.
Thank you.
Right.
And so I took photography and really discovered that while I could not paint or draw, I did have an eye for scenes and people and street photography. And I just loved it. To this day, I loved it. And I was just going to ask, have you continued that interest? I did for many years. I even had a dark room in my basement in my house many years ago. Then I was a community dark room person. Of course, now you don't use a dark room. Right. So I don't do that anymore, but I'm an avid photographer just for my own enjoyment mostly. That's great. That's great. How about academically? Did that, it sounds like this small environment, being in an environment with just women, gave you a real chance outside of the classroom to shine and do some things you hadn't done. You clearly set off on an academic path that sent you to law school and other pieces. What shape did that take here as you got started? I came to Colby determined to be a good student, a better student than I had been in high school. And Colby really set me on fire. I was thinking about the professors I had. So we had classes that were small. Professor Crosby, Professor Coop, Professor, I'm going to think of her name. She taught philosophy and love, which was also for me an eye-opening course. And I just fell in love with learning. And having the opportunity to sit in a professor's office and speak with him or her about whatever we were learning. I mean, Professor Crosby's class, there were 5 of us in one of his literature classes. And he told these amazing stories about his life in World War II when he was traveling through Nazi Germany. I mean, I still remember these stories. So I had many really memorable learning experiences there that I think set me on a course that in my other studies, during which I sought out small classes and small group learning, because I found it to be so much more, I learned more.
Great. When I first got to Colby-Sawyer, I would say to people that one of the things that has not changed about this place through being co-ed, being single sex, being 4-year, being 2-year, is the stories people tell about being in small classes, not having a lot of confidence, not being sure, that they wishing they were a better student in high school, whatever that combination might be, and finding that environment where suddenly they get a chance to sort of push it or explore or do something different. It's such a theme. My mom went to Colby Junior College in 1958 and 59.
Wow.
She had the same description of a different kind of class that you've had, and recent graduates say that same sort of thing. It's great, really terrific. How soon did you know you'd go to law school? I mean, was that something that formed here, or when you were at University of Vermont after being here?
It formed much younger, when I
Oh, great.
probably a child. The 60s were a big part of my growing up. I mean, I was young, but I was very aware of what was happening in the 60s, even though there were only 3 channels on television and no internet. I mean, there were assassinations and riots and the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so that was the background. That's what was normal to me.
Yeah.
Right. And I was always identified, for reasons I'm not quite sure, with underdogs, always.
Yep. Great.
And so I wanted to be a lawyer for that reason, essentially, to figure out a way to help people using the law. Yeah.
So you left here and went to the University of Vermont and then to Fordham Law. I'm going to ask you a cynical question about your transition to law school. When you having that mission of wanting to fight for the underdog and help folks, when you got to law school, did you see a path to be able to do? You've clearly been able to do that through public service, and we'll talk about your career. But when you got to law school, was that your experience right away that you're going to have a chance to do that, or was there a lot to wade through? I'm clearly thinking about experiences of attorneys who I know who slogged through some things before they got to do that when they're in law school, and I'm just interested in that experience.
Well, it started at University of Vermont. I co-founded the student legal services there.
Great.
With another student. And that was where I got my first taste of helping people navigate legal problems. And we worked with a lawyer. I was not a lawyer, so I couldn't give legal advice, but we affiliated ourselves with a lawyer from Burlington. And so I saw the power of being able to help people solve their problems, their legal problems. So I left University of Vermont. I didn't apply to law school right away. I took the LSATs and didn't do that well. So then, of course, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not smart enough, So I decided to move to New York City and become a paralegal to see, do I really have what it takes to be in this profession? I went to a 3-month certificate program in New York City, and then went to work at a law firm as a paralegal in Manhattan, which I did for 3 years. And by the end of that 3 years, I'm like, I can do this. I took the LSATs again. I took a prep course. I did really well on, or not really well. I did well enough on them to get into several law schools in New York City, and then started Fordham at what seemed to me to be the ripe old age of 25. And law school, I wasn't a huge fan of law school. Law school is really different now than it was in
Right.
1981. But I realized it was a rite of passage, something I had to get through to get to the end of the process. But it's so much better now. Law school is so much better now.
So you spent over 25 years in public service in the Attorney General's office in Maryland. Did that give you the chance to be the advocate you had pictured and do some of that work? I imagine having read your bio, having looked at your LinkedIn profile, you were doing a lot of different pieces of work in that office at different stages, and there must have been some bureaucracy to navigate, but it must have also given you a chance to connect with that public service piece as well.
So yes and no. I spent a few years in private practice in New York and in Baltimore, and my first job was with the Attorney General's office, for those of you on the call, is the law firm to the state.
Right.
So New Hampshire has a New Hampshire Attorney General. So every state has one. And at that point, my first job there was to represent the Department of Health. And mostly I was defending them.
Right.
So I did that for a few years, and I learned a ton doing that, because I represented state hospital centers where people with really critical disabilities lived, and the state was being sued by the Department of Justice for how could we maintain such horrible places in the state. So I was on the state side there, but you're right, Dan, I did spend most of my time in the Attorney General's 13 years representing higher ed institutions. That was my next.
Oh, wow.
There.
Yeah.
And what that meant was, so every state has a state university system, and their lawyers tend to be lawyers in the Attorney General's office for that state. And oftentimes they have counsel on campus. And I then undertook a practice of law, so advising, giving advice. University of Maryland is a huge public institute. It's got 11 campuses.
Yeah.
And then there's all these other state funded institutions that are smaller that I also, me and about 15 other lawyers, gave advice and then defended them in court. So I was always defense counsel. I wasn't the white hat, save the day, but what I was able to do was, if my clients had really messed up, I didn't have to fight to the tooth. I could say to them, we messed up. We need to make this right.
Right.
And let's figure out a way to make this right. And so that's what I liked about being in public service, is being able to do that. I mean, there are many things I liked about it, but so I had some very interesting cases. Higher education, as you may know, is often on the forefront of changes that are happening in our society. And so we handled, and when you represent a state university, I call it practicing constitutional law every day, because the Constitution governs what you do. It governs how you treat your employees. It governs whether you can ban certain things at sporting events because maybe it violates the First Amendment. So it was really interesting work. It was never boring. And I used to say, when I retire, I'm going to write a TV series called Higher Education that has a cast of faculty, staff, and students, because you just can't believe the stuff that goes on. It would be compelling.
So what was the transition point or decision-making point about transitioning from the Attorney General's office and that higher ed practice to actually working for the University of Maryland Carey School of Law and making that choice?
Okay, that was, for the 20 years that I practiced law, I did a lot of trial work. And for any of you who've ever been interested in doing trial work, I loved it. I loved it, loved it, loved it. It's exhausting. It's a 20-hour-a-day job. And so whenever I had a trial, my mom had to come or my mother-in-law had to come. I had little kids. I couldn't be working 9 to 5. I was working 9 to 9, during trial prep and trial. And so, but I loved that. And I did it for a long time. And then my last trial, which was a great case, another one of these, you can't make it up set of facts. But I realized I had lost my desire to work that hard in that way. I felt like I had done everything I wanted to do, because one of the beauties of being in the Attorney General's office, for any of you budding lawyers out there, I would encourage you to consider it. Not only do you get to try the case, but you get to handle the appeal.
Right.
And then you get to handle the appeal maybe all the way to the top court in your state, or the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where I found myself. And so that's just a very lucky thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
And so I had done trial work, I had done appellate work, I taught as an adjunct at the law school, I taught legal writing, and I just was ready to make a career switch. I was in the midst of trying to figure out what that would be. I was looking at a variety of things, and the opportunity to apply to become the Dean of Students at the University of Maryland Law School fell in my lap, and I applied.
That's great. Before, it occurs to me I wasn't sure whether I could ask you about particular cases when, was there a particular, in that, before we talk about being at the University of Maryland at the law school, was there a particular set of a case that got appealed up to the appellate court that really stuck with you? And is there a case you can talk about that you just, it really changed what was happening in the University of Maryland system and stuck with you personally because of that appeal process and just fighting and being there?
Yes. So a couple of them. Well,
yeah.
There's one that a lot of people might know about. So the University of Michigan was sued for the fact of how it used race in admission. Yep. And the University of Maryland School of Medicine was sued for the exact same reason by a similar group of lawyers.
Yeah.
And I successfully defended that case.
Oh, wow.
It was a white person claiming that if I had been Black, he would have accepted me. And yeah, so that was it was a complicated case, but you can use a lot of creativity in law with the rules of procedure, which I won't bore you with now, but suffice it to say, we won that case. It was appealed, and we were upheld on an appeal. I guess the case that stuck with me, that changed the law in Maryland, that changed the way things work, really arose out of a case where, again, someone sued one of my universities. But what happened in the middle of the case is the lawyer for the person suing us called my client and had a conversation without me being present. And actually, the person was no longer working for my university, left, but called that person and had a conversation without me being present, and then used all that information to try to really nail my client, the university, Bowie State University. And I remember that day, and she accused me of hiding. Then she used this whole, you claiming I broke all kinds of rules. So I was all stressed out about that. Then I had to go, wait a minute, what's she doing talking to our former employee about the conversation that he and I had? That was a confidential conversation. Long story short, I did my homework. There wasn't any exact law on it, but I argued that was a violation of the rules of ethics to do that.
Sure. And
that any information she gained from that conversation should be excluded from the case. And oh, by the way, the lawyer should be kicked out of the case, because you can't undo what you learned.
Right.
So I'll never forget, we went to the argument. I made the argument. The federal court judge didn't say anything. And then he said, "Counsel, may I see you in chambers?" It's like, sure.
Does that strike fear in you?
No, like, he must want to say something off the record, because there's a record that's made of what everyone says.
Yeah.
Go into the chambers, and he looks at the other lawyer and he said, "What on earth ever made you think you could do that? And where did you go to law school?"
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of situation where you say nothing. I said nothing.
Wow. And
then we got a big ruling in our favor that changed the law about when you can contact a former employee, when you can't, so that probably was one of the more.
That's great. Wow.
I hope that wasn't too much detail.
No, it's really great. And I think for those of us who, I mean, I'm looking at the participants online here, and I recognize a lot of the names. We have a number of attorneys who've been litigators, but a lot of us are just people, this is like watching some TV show for us and getting some sense of it. So it's great. It's great.
Okay.
So you made that transition to being the dean of students at the law school. And the last couple of years you were at the law school, you ran the free legal advice clinic as the director.
Right.
I'm imagining that set you off on the latest path that you pursued, but I'm curious about that time as an administrator in the law school and then the transition to directing the free clinic, because it seems like two very different roles, but maybe it wasn't.
Well, I was dean for 6 years, and what I loved about that, I just have to say, because I love being part of bringing the next generation of lawyers along. And I love being able to, I was the first person they met on the first day of law school. I was able to really send the message that your professional life starts here, and how you conduct yourself from here on out matters.
That's great.
Because for all the lawyers, and we all know these lawyers that we hate to deal with, that you can't trust, there's too much of it. But actually getting into the whole free legal advice thing started in another capacity outside of my professional life. I'm involved in a giving circle of women. We're about 400 of us. We all put the same amount of money in the bank, and then we grant it out to organizations whose mission somehow benefits women. And one of those organizations is the Goucher College Prison Education Partnership. Goucher College is a liberal arts college here in Baltimore. They have a division in the men's and women's prison. And I was assigned the task of going out there to see how things were going with our grant. And that's when I saw the impact of education on incarcerated people.
Great.
I mean, I cried.
Yeah.
I cried. I get teary thinking about it. So that was about 2010. And so I then became involved in supporting prison education at the same time that I was just doing my job, whatever, whether an AG's officer. No, I was still at law school then. And then I stopped being the dean of law school and started running this. I still wanted to work there, but I didn't want to be the dean of students anymore. And so I ran this program called the Just Advice Project, which provided free legal advice to anybody who walked in the door. Students did the intake. So that was their opportunity to learn how to ask questions, how to distill legal problems from social work problems, from mental health problems, and then to come to the lawyers in the room and say, Mr. Parrish is here today because, and they would have to explain, and then we lawyers would sit by the sides of the students and give the advice. And of course, I ran into a number of people who had prison records. Then I was also at the same time helping anyone who came out of the Goucher program who was reentering. I was sitting one-on-one with them and helping them navigate.
Wow.
So it was and plus I had friends who had been in prison, people I knew who had really had a rough go of it afterwards. So it was a progression of events that got me to where I got to the point where like, okay, I'm not teaching anymore. I'm not working in the law school anymore. There's a lot of things I still want to do in my life. And this is one area of my life that I really want to focus on because the need is so huge.
Yeah.
People coming out of prison, people with felony records experience more barriers than you can imagine. And so much is expected of them when they come out, and so little is given to them to help them be successful.
Right. So how many years you started with the Women's Giving Circle, you got involved with the Goucher program, and through that, you began to see just all these incredible barriers that incarcerated folks face as they transition. How many years were you doing this before you created Return Home Baltimore? And you must have been trying to solve or address and navigate problems just one by one? I mean, were you doing it with a little bit of duct tape and a lot of energy? You know, I mean, were you just trying to fill holes and address these one by one and suddenly realize that it was systemic?
Right. The head of the Gouger program would say, hey, Dawna, so-and-so's getting out. Would you meet with him?
Yeah.
So I'd say, sure, I'll meet with him. And I started doing that like 2010 or 11. And because I understood higher ed, because so many of them had been in college while in prison, that was a big part of what I was trying to help them do.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned, you may know this, like all the men out there who are under 26, make sure you register with a selective service, because if you don't, and you can't get a job with the federal government, you can't get a federal student loan. And so I ran into that. And so there were myriad issues I ran into with folks one-on-one. But then of course I saw the information that was available to them was totally siloed. There was no one place.
Right.
No.
Right.
So the idea, actually, my husband, my second husband, so he's the one I did the project with, I started bringing him along to these meetings. And so we decided we wanted to do something for returning citizens. We weren't sure what, so we spent a year talking to people in that community, both returning citizens and the nonprofit people who work with them, to get a sense of what it was we could do without we didn't want to have employees. We wanted to keep it simple, but we wanted to make an impact. And that's where we ended up on this idea of creating a website that was a resource, that was easy to use, that was intuitive and up to date and kept up to date. And that's how we settled on it. And then we spent a year designing it.
And having seen your board members and some of the folks involved, you're taking advice from people who are going through the transition to keep it up to date and trying to see where you might have blind spots that they've experienced.
Yeah, I mean, here we are, two white people in a majority Black city with this project, and it was important to us both that we had representation of all different backgrounds as part of our advisory board. So both people who'd been in prison, people who work with people who've been in prison. So two of the people on my board went through Goucher, were in prison and went to Goucher. Another person was on my board. He was in prison for 32 years before he was exonerated.
Wow.
So they're huge, they're our go-to folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there other organizations and this is a question we got before the webinar from one of the alums who registered. Are there other organizations out there that you've been able to steal good ideas from and share advice with? Are there people doing this work in other big metropolitan areas that you can sort of see how it's working, or are you inventing the wheel a little bit every day?
So they're out there. There's not many of them.
Yeah.
And we find each other by accident. I learned a lot about SEO on the internet, buying Google ads and Google words so that our website turns up. But I've met people from all over the country who have found us and who work in this field and who think our website's amazing. So yes, there are other ones out there. I think ours and I'm just telling what people have told us.
Yeah.
That it's really one of the most effective because it's so easy and so intuitive. And it's actually beautiful. You know, you look at some of the other ones, there's just like so much text and so.
Keeping it intuitive and simple is a key to some success for people coming back and making use of the resource.
But I've spent 2 years avidly networking in the nonprofit and the returning citizen world. And so I have so when I find a new resource that I want to put on the website, I will go to those folks. I'll go to the other nonprofits. I have a couple people that I call who are both returning citizens who run nonprofits now. So do you know there's this housing outfit on the West Side? Do you know this guy? And they'll go and they'll check it out for me.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That makes me think, are there, I don't know, sort of problem areas or particular issues, persistent issues that just aren't improving, that as folks transition, are you experiencing some of the same things over and over again, and there's a hole in the resources that you just can't find people? what's the worst? I mean, what's the worst case scenario there? The worst issue that just is persistent over and over again.
Oh boy. Okay. So
I don't know. I don't know if that's an impossible question to answer.
No. It's just so housing is number one.
Yeah.
Housing is a huge problem for people coming out. Oftentimes going back to their home is the last place they need, assuming that you can have a home to go to. So Joe and I, my husband and I, are in the middle of working with a nonprofit in Baltimore that has a home sharing program.
Oh, wow.
To design, for lack of a better, Airbnb for returning citizens, matching returning citizens with people who have extra space in their home, wrapping supports around both the host and the person returning home. And we're working at, there's a very successful program in California that we're modeling after. So that's what we're actually we're trying to create a model that might be scalable.
Great.
So housing's one, a job.
Yeah.
So there's this thing called collateral consequences, and collateral consequences are either a law or a reg or a rule that says if you have a criminal record, you can't have this housing voucher, you can't get a job here, you can't be a barber, you can't do, in Maryland, there's 1,100 of them. You
can't receive this service or that support or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
You can't vote in so many places, whatever.
Yes. In some places you can't vote.
Yeah.
And there's a second chance movement, which is second chance, meaning giving people who have felony records. So there's like 19 million people in the United States with a felony record, and there's 70 million people in the United States with a criminal record.
Wow.
So it's huge. Yeah. So the idea is to give second chances to people with those barriers. And there's lots of ways to go about it. So jobs and housing. Not to mention just the trauma. Like I work with a woman, I'm a parole advocate. So I'm helping a woman prepare for her parole hearing. And she was given early release, which is great, right? But she's home. She's like, Dawna, this is really weird. This is really hard. For 10 years, I was told what to do, when to do it, how to do it. This is hard. Yeah. And then there's just the trauma of having been in prison and what even happened to you before you went to prison. So mental health, substance use, housing.
Right.
A lot of fun.
We talked when we met earlier a little bit just about the point in time we're at globally with COVID and the pandemic. Your mention of housing just makes me think that housing is the tightness of the housing market is an issue all across the United States. There is no housing available for anyone, and particularly not for folks who might be low income, who might be housing insecure. Has COVID, I imagine it's had a huge impact on how you operate, how Return Home Baltimore operates, but for each of the folks you're dealing with, beyond the housing piece, what has COVID meant for folks transitioning out of prison and back returning citizens? What does it mean for them?
COVID had a huge impact in prison because of the lack of resources, people separated and out, right? It just, and anything that we all felt, they felt times 10. Right? Programs shut down, resources shut down. It was really rough, really rough. The silver lining, there is a silver lining, and the silver lining is prison systems are using technology. Hello, right? Like Zoom, and adjusting to the fact that, wow, we can use technology to educate folks in prison, to communicate with family members and advocates and lawyers. I don't know if you've ever visited a prison, but in order to get in one, you have to give so much information, and you could get there and they're like, oh, sorry, not today.
Yes.
Right. So, it made it hard on every level, but there's been some silver linings that we're hoping to take advantage of.
I don't know if this was part of the impact of the pandemic that some folks you're advocating for as a parole advocate. did their release get accelerated or delayed
Yes.
because of the pandemic? And did both of those things happen, acceleration and delay? Because in some places they just wanted to get people out, and in other places the bureaucracy just shut down?
So I can't say I know all the ins and outs about what
Yeah.
happened, but I know that my lady and right. So yes, people were released early in
Yep.
some cases to home detention, which means you're paying for this thing around your ankle, and you have to, call in anytime you want to go anywhere, but at least you're
Right.
out of prison, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, COVID was rough.
We received a question from when people registered about the Dismas House network, and I'm sure I'm not saying that right. And I don't know if you are familiar with, I know there are a couple of national networks like that organization, and I think the question came from somebody here locally because we have a chapter up in White River Junction, Vermont. I don't know if you're familiar with these kind of housing group home networks like that, or have had any experience in Baltimore with an organization like that?
I know the name.
Yeah.
I know, not in Baltimore. I actually Googled it before I got on here.
Yeah.
In Baltimore, apparently it was part of the Department of Corrections. So it's closed in Baltimore. I believe there might be one in another part of the state, but so I know the name and I know very little about it. And I think that's because we don't have an organization locally that we would list as a resource.
Yeah, and hence you're trying to create this thing with housing that you're doing now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, but someone asked me a question about were there men on campus when I was at Colby, and so there was one man. There was one man.
The person asking, I think the person asking the question knows that man, and that may be why she's
Richard.
asking.
His name was Dick Richard.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
We all knew him. Yeah. No.
There actually, during that period of time, there were a handful. The one who graduated first is, I think, the person you're talking about, if I've got it right. Yes, she's responding and saying, yes, it was him. And there were a handful of men who took classes around that time. But I, don't know if you were aware of them. You knew him, apparently.
He was the one I knew.
Great. And I will disclose that
Brooks, my friend Brooks, is saying there were 3 others. Well, of course, Brooks, you knew them. I did.
And I promised Dawna that we would not. We did get one question from a member of the class of 1977 who knew Dawna from living in Burpee, who asked if she remembered the song. And we will not make you recite the Burpee song or try to sing that. And
it's like I was like, oh my gosh, I don't remember. I'm so embarrassed. I don't remember it. Many other things like Colby night at Colby camp on Little Lake Sunapee.
Yeah.
Yes, and then there was that ritual thing that happened at the end of the year where we were blindfolded and taken somewhere in a horse and buggy. I mean, am I like, did I bring that up?
I will let others who are watching you, I will let your friends comment on whether that really happened, and I don't know anything about it. But on a more serious note, in addition to Return Home Baltimore, you mentioned the Women's Giving Circle, and you're both in your career and your work, you've been, for lack of a better way to describe it, really engaged in social justice, and engaged in not just philanthropy, but really community service. And it sounds like that started really early. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how your experiences at Colby Junior College, UVM, Fordham Law helped cement that, because I think lots of young people get engaged in service, but it's easy to drift away once you've graduated and you raised children, you were trying to juggle career and job. You've been able to return to it and stay committed to it. And I don't know if you're conscious of how you were able to keep that going and how it stayed a prominent piece and a priority.
I think the seeds were planted during college, both at Colby, where I think I became a much more of a critical thinker, right? And then at Vermont, where I was actually able to start problem solving, around the need for the student legal service. And then when I moved to New York City, it was really hard to figure out how to engage in a big place like that. It was hard. I did never really find my path. But when I came to Baltimore and I moved to a neighborhood that had a very strong community organization, it's really where I learned to become engaged at the community level. And I ended up being president of my community association. I mean, there's a long litany of things, but I've always just found that work to be very collaborative, challenging. The problems are different than the problems that I had at my job.
Yep.
It was a bonding experience to work with people. So I think it was a progression that started at Colby.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think, oh, and you're getting praise from your friend Brooks. I think, oh, she's made the comments so everybody can see it. We appreciate that. I think we're also getting a couple comments in the chat that not everybody in the audience can see, but just that confirmation that the problem solving piece that you described, and it goes back to where we started with talking about your experience at Colby Junior College. Being in a small place, you got a chance to sort of work those problems out. Maybe there's a little less risk than in real life. You can try to solve problems and have a safety net a little bit underneath you. And I'm not surprised to hear from Brooks that you were a very patient dorm president. Dawna, we're really grateful for your time and for, oh, but here's somebody remembers the burpee song and is sharing it in the chat. So for those of you in the audience who want to know the burpee song, I don't know, Dawna, if that brings back any memories. I'm assuming you don't want to sing it all for us.
No, but thank you, Ann Erickson, for sharing it. Now it comes back to me.
That's great. That's great. Dawna, we're so grateful for the time that you spent with us and really, sharing your experience and to be able to see your engagement with public service and social justice through your career. I'm sure there were days where the job just felt like a job, but you've landed in really a remarkable place in your work with I've learned a new term today, returning citizens rather than formerly incarcerated. So I'm gonna continue to use that in my lexicon every day, and I appreciate that. And we're really grateful for your time sharing this with alumni and with folks here locally and folks on campus. It's really really a kind of a blessing for all of us to hear about your experiences and hear how Colby Junior College helped shape those.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure. It's been great to talk to you.
And thanks to all of you who joined us. We will send the recording out in the next few days. And Dawna, as I said, these recordings always get a lot of viewings. We have faculty members who share them with students as well to make sure that folks, and this feels like a real sort of primer on how to stay focused on what you want to do and pursue that goal. And we appreciate it. We're really grateful to you for that. Thanks so much.
Take care. Be well.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.